if we look at all the paths, all the methods that have been presented by enlightened beings, whether it be the Buddha or Krishna or Shankara or any kind of master, you will see that the very basis, if you go deep and dig down into the very fundamentals of that certain yoga type that they taught, for example, you will see that they all are concerning giving up the identity, just giving up everything and letting it all go into the void. And I will give two examples to show this from two branches which are apparently contradictory, but in reality they are very much the same. So if we read the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the most ancient texts of the planet, you will see that Krishna speaks about himself mainly, but we understand that it is the consciousness, the Krishna consciousness that speaks in reality. So he uses the word I a lot of times. And whenever we look at it, you realize that he has never, ever, not even once, spoken about himself as the form. Never. So whenever he used the pronoun I, he refers to the consciousness, the Krishna consciousness, which is the omnipresent consciousness being present in every atom of creation. And he uses this I to show his disciple, Arjuna, what shall be known. And if we keep reading and reading, what we see is that he refers to indifference as his true nature. And if we think about what indifference is, if it's connected to the void, we will say yes, because if you're indifferent, it means that the mind has been stilled, because if the mind hasn't been stilled, you just cannot be indifferent, you cannot be in union, because the mind will say, oh, but this and but that. And when there is this and when there is that, certainly there are still things to dissolve. And it means that the mind has been dissolved, and it means that the thing in which the mind has been dissolved is the self, which we call existence, consciousness, bliss, sat, chit, ananda. And when things are dissolved in that, you truly enter the empty space. Another branch is the branch of Buddhism, because it's one of the major pillars of Buddhism is the Anatman, which means that there is no part in the mind that is changeless, that the mind and this existence, this plane of existence, is in ever-changing motion, and thinking that there is an unchanging self is ignorance. This is what they say. And if you look at it, what it says is that there is no identity you should have about yourself. You should just dissolve in Nirvana, which is indeed bliss, as the Buddha describes. There is no greater bliss than Nirvana. And we know that the bonum summum, the goal of Buddhism, is to attain to Nirvana. So they say that there is no need to any kind of identity whatsoever, just dissolve into the bliss which arises from the emptiness, and we shall see how, and just dissolve in that, and then you are free. You don't have to have ideas about who you are and all the ends questions, because your identity will be the no identity. And when your identity becomes the no identity, this is when we say that you are one with the Atman, which is called the self, which doesn't have to have anything to do with the feelings of I and mine and me and the rest. And the question now that how does bliss arise when there is nothingness? The answer is very simple. that nothingness is the empty space, is existence, consciousness, and bliss. And through experience, we see that if you dissolve the mental functions in the mind, you just attain a perfect state of ecstasy when you are ecstatic because existence. And since existence cannot be an object, it means that it's not just happiness, it is beyond that. It's happiness without an object, which we call ecstasy or bliss. And then you see that actually bliss arises from nothingness, because you realize that there's nothing to worry about, there's nothing there to be concerned about, not that you could be concerned when you don't have a mind. So this is what we mean by dissolving the self, the small self, into the Atman. And so we have seen two examples of seemingly counter branches, which we have seen that are not counter branches whatsoever. And now the means of attaining this, there are, as they say, 112 ways of attaining enlightenment, liberation, mukti, moksha, as you wish to call it. And all of them are how to connect the mind to the nothingness so that the mind dissolves into the nothingness. And let us just give some examples of this. One shall see that whenever there is a thing that happens in a frequency, that happens in waves. For example, breathing happens in frequencies because you breathe in, you breathe out, and between the in-breath and the out-breath, there may be a gap, a free space where there is neither of those, neither inhalation nor exhalation. And we say that if you can create this universal pause, break between the two breaths, there you can find enlightenment, because enlightenment is really seeing that your identity is the no identity. This is what we call enlightenment. So we see that if you go into this void between the two breaths, certainly you can attain enlightenment, because the mind becomes still. Because if you see and if you take very big awareness and if you look at it, you will see that the breaths are like some tornadoes in the mind that create a lot of patterns. Because if you didn't breathe, you wouldn't think, you wouldn't have a mind to think with. So stilling the breathing is going to still also the functions of the mind. If you think about it, mainly when the breathing becomes very turbulated, exaggerated, it's in mainly two cases. One, when there is a fear in the body of survivor, immediately the breathing becomes quicker, faster, in a bigger frequency. And you will see that there is no gap between the two breaths, because you are like, and there is no break between the two breaths. And we know that survival is not enlightenment, so certainly that is not the way to go. Another time when breathing becomes very powerful is when one has lost sexual desires. Then also the breathing becomes exaggerated, very powerful. And again, it seems that there are so many thoughts washing the mind that certainly the breathing also supports this, and then you create a circle of thoughts arising and breathing arising, and these two support one another. So certainly, again, you see that when there is no gap, there is no enlightenment either. And the experience shows that the stiller the breathing, the larger the gap between two breaths. At some point, one can go beyond the breath and enter the breathless state, where there is no mind function whatsoever. And the body doesn't die out because the cosmic forces support the survival of the body during those times. And between the two gaps, the two breaths in the gap, the more one concentrates on the gap between the two breaths and dissolves the thoughts in that gap, there you can attain perfection. Even if you don't see the gap, you just keep breathing and breathing and you're aware of the moment of the breath. Even then you can attain, because you concentrate on the object being the breath, and whatever thought may arise, you just let it go because you stick to the breath. Because the only thing which is the same in the three states of consciousness, namely waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, is that there is breathing in all those three. So if you master the breathing, not necessarily the gap, but the breathing, how it comes in and goes out, you can be aware and conscious during even dreaming, and then we call it a conscious dream or lucid dreaming. And then certainly you can even go deep into the dream state and simply just change the things in the mind as need be. And then again, you can attain, as it is said, because if you think about dream state and waking state, there is a gap between the two. Most of the human beings don't remember the moment when you fall asleep, but certainly there's a gap, because there is the waking state and there is the dreaming state. Between those two, again, there is a gap, there is a break, and it is actually unmanifested reality, because the manifested reality are the waking and the dreaming, and between those two there is this gap which we just cross. But in reality, if you can maintain that gap between the two, there is also empty space there, which actually, you know, in reality prevails even the waking and the dreaming state, that we call the witness, or with other names, the self or the Atman, which is just witnessing all the functions without getting entangled in it. And if you look at it between the two states, that gap is the witness, and if you realize to be the witness, you can just go into that gap. And this is how certain yogis in certain traditions have attained not to even need to sleep, because as they testified, for them there is no difference between sleeping or waking up. Why? Because they realize that the witness, the self, is beyond both, and that actually it is the body who needs that. But if the body gets fueled by the self, you don't need these changes in the consciousness. Now again, if you think about it, there is pain and pleasure as the two extremes in duality. And again, we say that there is a gap, a space between the two. There is that space which is even beyond neutrality. It is just empty space simply, which is just there, which prevails both happiness and sorrow, because in reality happiness is just another kind of sorrow, because as long as you don't attain to the self, everything is just misery, either in happiness or in pain, but there is still transitoriness in the picture. So this is why we keep saying that the self is the final goal, and we don't lose track the final goal. Even if we are not yet in the self, we know that that is the final goal, to be the self at the end. So therefore, we say that even between happiness and sadness, there's a gap. There's that free space that can be entered. And if you enter that free space, you will get rid of both, and you will not be the slave of happiness and sadness, but they will be your slaves. You will conduct them in the life, not they will conduct you in the life. Again, sounds are a way of going beyond transitory existence, going into the empty space. Why? If you look at, for example, the chant Om, A-U-M, and if you start to say out the words, the sounds, as simply free space, nothingness in there, and you just keep chanting without the nothingness, within the nothingness, you will see a double-folded reality. What does it mean? So the Om represents, the A represents the physical gross reality, then the U represents the astral world, astral reality, and the M represents that which is beyond the functions of the mind. So the Om actually is the start of creation and the end of creation. And now there is this way of method that you start to chant the Om, and you do it in a descending volume, the descending power. And you start to say Om and Om and Om, and you go some more and more silent. And what you're doing in reality is that from the powerful saying out of the Om, you go to the subtle and subtle and subtle expressions of the Om, to the point when you become so immersed in the Om that actually you no longer have to express it, rather you enter, as Shiva says, a silent harmony, where you actually attain that M at the Om, when you no longer have to express that, because that is the end, because Om is the creation and the end of creation. And if you realize that every sound is just empty space, free from qualities, and just some manifested empty space, without a dweller in it, without any meaning, you just dwell in this silence. And this is why in a lot of kind of meditations, there is a chanting or a song that you sing, because all the yoga systems were built on these 112 ways. And you know, there are certain ways in this 112 that can be mixed together in a sophisticated manner. And then you can use up that as a way of enlightenment. For example, certain Kriya yogas are based upon concentrating on the third eye and being aware of the moment of the breath. And we have already spoken about the moment of the breath and how it liberates. And there is also a part of chanting the Om. And again, we see that these two things come together as tools for the same goal. Even though, you know, one method is just enough to attain liberation, there are 112 so that you can pick your favorites, and so that you can make anything out of those. Because for the wise person who has already attained, one is just enough. But for those who struggle with it, you know, there's a possibility to do it in several ways so that everybody can find a personalized, efficient way to do it. And of course, there's no problem with it. This is how things work in this created universe. So sounds and breath are both, and objects are all means of liberation. And actually, all of these we have seen are concerning about how to enter the void and how to enter empty space, leaving aside everything and just being that supreme state. And the Buddhists say that Nirvana is not a state of consciousness, and they are correct in this one. Why? Because if it's the state of consciousness, it means that there's also another state of consciousness, which means that you can still move between states. And Nirvana, or Nirvikalpa Samadhi, if we desire to call it as such, it simply means that there is no state of consciousness. It is experiencing consciousness as it is, not in different states of moods and changes, rather in its inert form of all prevailing existence. That is then what we say that is Nirvana or Nirvikalpa Samadhi, that every patterning in the mind is gone, and therefore you cannot jump back to another states. Why? Because there isn't any other state to jump back to. This is why they say that as long as one doesn't attain Nirvana or Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and I say these both names so that everybody understands either of those. If you attain, till you don't attain that, you still have the possibility to go into other states. And you can go into other states of consciousnesses, which means that you can go backwards or forward, but the final goal is to go beyond qualities, because states in reality are qualities that the consciousness assumes for itself. But if you just go beyond all qualities and you see consciousness as consciousness without any qualities, as good consciousness, bad consciousness, high consciousness, low consciousness, this consciousness, that consciousness, simply just consciousness as the nature of everything, at that point you no longer can fall back, because there are no more colorings in the thoughts, which means that there are no thoughts that arise, that there is no thought you can jump to, there is no platform of thoughts you can arrive at, because there's only consciousness and consciousness and consciousness. There's nothing else, and there you have no choice of picking this or that. As long as you have qualities of good things and bad things, you can pick any kind of color between black and white, and you can go on the scale of colors as much as you want. But if you desire and destroy the qualities, then there is only consciousness as in bliss, and we know that bliss is not a quality, it is the self itself, not as a quality of the self. So knowing this, these are several ways of attaining emptiness, constant concentration, because Nirvikalpa Samadhi means the following. Samadhi means concentration. Vikalpa means thought forms, thought patterns. Nir means without. So it's actually concentration without thought processes. This is what it means. And now that we say it in English, it seems to be so easy. Oh, just concentrate without thoughts, and that's it. And that is what we call the highest consciousness possible. And so, knowing that it's simply just silencing the mind and dissolving it into the non-identity, simply one becomes free from everything, bondage and liberation, even the thought of these two. And at that point, one experiences and enjoys the supreme state of ecstasy that we call Shiva.